The signal was 312 years old when it reached liaison officer Viketh Sondurai's console, and by then, every soul who had originally screamed it into the void was already dust. Sondurai was not supposed to be the one who found it. She was the third watch communications liaison aboard the Ascendancy monitoring station Pale Terminus, a mid-tier signals intelligence post orbiting the gas giant Kethon 4, and her primary assignment was sorting diplomatic intercepts from the Velori Compact's trade negotiations, a task that required roughly 10% of her attention and produced roughly 0% of anything actionable. The Velori negotiated the way tides moved, slowly, predictably, in patterns that had not meaningfully changed in 4 centuries. But the signal was not a trade intercept. It arrived on a frequency band that Pale Terminus was not actively monitoring. The band was cataloged in the station's architecture as Tertiary Legacy Channel 9, a relic designation from the station's original construction 3 centuries prior, when the Dravani Ascendancy had maintained a far wider listening net across the outer territories. Most of the legacy channels had been decommissioned decades ago, their hardware repurposed or simply left to decay. Channel 9 survived only because it shared a power conduit with the station's atmospheric recyclers, and nobody had wanted to risk a shutdown to pull the wiring. The signal came in at 3:47 station time, during the dead hours when Sondurai was alone at the communications array. It registered as a faint carrier wave on Channel 9's dormant receiver, a pulse so weak that the station's automated systems logged it as background radiation and flagged it for deletion. Sondurai saw the flag. She almost let it pass. But the waveform had structure, not the diffuse pattern of cosmic noise or the regular pulse of a navigational beacon. This was modulated, deliberately. Someone had encoded information into this signal, and the encoding carried a cadence that Sondurai recognized from her training at the Ascendancy's Joint Signals Academy on Vethar Prime, the cadence of a general distress broadcast. She isolated the signal and ran it through the station's decryption suite, which took 14 minutes because the encryption protocol was so old that the software had to search archived libraries to find a matching cipher. When the decode finally rendered, Sondurai read it 3 times. Emergency distress, DREVANI Colonial Authority Settlement Designation, VRATH, crossing population 41,200, catastrophic atmospheric collapse. All support requested coordinates ENCODED. This signal is directed to DREVANI Ascendancy, High Command ON Primary Military Frequency. Repeat, all support requested, we are dying. The timestamp embedded in the signal's header read, year 1714 of the Ascendancy calendar. The current year was 2026. 312 years. The signal had been traveling for 312 years, bouncing through relay stations and gravitational eddies, and the accumulated interference of 3 centuries of galactic traffic, losing strength with every reflection, degrading with every pass through a dust cloud or magnetic field, until it arrived at Pale Terminus as a whisper so faint that only a decommissioned legacy channel on a power conduit nobody had bothered to pull could have caught it. Vereth Crossing. Sondurai knew the name. Every Dravani knew the name, the way a nation knows the names of its historic disasters. Vereth Crossing had been a colonial settlement on the outer rim of Dravani territory, established during the expansion era as a mining and agricultural outpost. In the year 1714, the settlement's atmospheric processors had suffered a cascading failure, a confluence of mechanical breakdowns, supply chain disruptions, and a freak coronal event from the local star that had overwhelmed the radiation shielding and cooked the atmospheric regulators from the inside. The official histories called it the convergence, because no single factor had been sufficient to cause the disaster. It had taken all of them arriving simultaneously, feeding on each other, building into something that no contingency plan had been designed to survive. 41,200 colonists. The Ascendancy had dispatched a relief fleet. The fleet arrived 19 days after the atmospheric collapse began. By then, the colony's air had been unbreathable for 6 days. The fleet found sealed habitat modules scattered across the settlement's surface, each one a pocket of survivable atmosphere that the colonists had retreated into as the main processors failed. Some modules held hundreds, some held dozens. The fleet opened them one by one. 22,308 survivors, 18,892 dead, suffocated in corridors between modules, in modules whose seals had failed, in the open when the atmosphere turned toxic faster than they could run. Sandurai knew these numbers. She had studied them at the academy, where the convergence was taught as a case study in cascading system failure. She had memorized the timeline. She had written an analysis of the Ascendancy's response protocols and their inadequacies. She knew the names of the colony's administrators, Governor Pelin Vossaren, who had organized the retreat into the habitat modules and had been found dead in Corridor 17, his hand still on the emergency seal he had been trying to close when the atmosphere failed. Chief Communications Officer Dareth Kosen, who had transmitted the distress signal and then spent her remaining hours manually rerouting the colony's internal communications to coordinate the evacuation into the modules, and who had died at her console with the transmitter still broadcasting. Kosen had been 26 years old, 4 years younger than Sandurai was now. She had graduated from the same Signals Academy 2 centuries and change earlier. The Academy kept her portrait in the Hall of Exemplars, not because she had succeeded in raising help, but because she had continued to broadcast knowing that she probably would not. Sandurai had walked past that portrait every day for 3 years. Sandurai had read Kosen's final log entry as part of her Academy analysis. It was brief, procedural, and devastating in its restraint. Signal transmitted. No acknowledgement. Retransmitting on backup frequency. No acknowledgement. Atmospheric levels critical, sealing communications center, will continue to broadcast as long as power permits. She had continued to broadcast for 11 hours. Nobody heard her. The records showed that Kosen had tried 4 backup frequencies after the primary failed. She had manually recalibrated the transmission array twice, squeezing coherence from a system that the coronal event was actively degrading. She had logged each attempt with the terse professionalism of someone trained to document even when documentation was the only thing she could still do. The last entry before the power failed was a single line. Atmospheric recycler offline. Estimated breathable air, 40 minutes, still broadcasting. Sandurai had never, in any of that study, considered the possibility that the colony's original distress signal, the first desperate scream for help, transmitted on the primary military frequency and aimed at high command, had never actually arrived. The histories recorded that the signal had been sent. The histories did not record that it had been received. The distinction had never seemed important because the relief fleet had come anyway, summoned by other means. The signal's fate was a footnote that nobody had thought to investigate. Until a decommissioned receiver on a station orbiting a gas giant caught its echo, 3 centuries later, and a third watch liaison officer, who should have been sorting trade intercepts, saw a waveform that should have been deleted and chose to look. She stared at the decoded signal on her screen. Directed to Dravani Ascendancy, High Command on primary military frequency. The colonists had aimed their cry correctly. They had followed every protocol. But the coronal event that destroyed the atmospheric processors had also disrupted the local subspace relay network. Sandurai could see it in the signal's propagation data. The way the beam had scattered and refracted through ionized space, bending away from its intended trajectory. The signal had missed high command entirely. It had bounced through 3 centuries of relay infrastructure, losing coherence with every reflection, until it finally washed up on the shore of a decommissioned channel. 312 years late. High Command had eventually learned of the disaster through other means. A scheduled supply vessel that arrived at Vareth Crossing and found the colony in crisis. That vessel relayed the alert, and the relief fleet launched within hours. But the original signal, the colony's own cry for help, had never reached anyone. Until now. Sandurai sat in the quiet of the communications bay and felt something settle in her chest. It was not grief, exactly. The dead of Vareth Crossing had been mourned for 3 centuries. Memorials stood on 4 Drevani worlds. The anniversary was observed with a day of reflection. What she felt was colder. The signal had been aimed correctly. The colonists had done everything right. They had followed the protocols, used the correct frequency, transmitted to the correct authority, and the signal had never arrived. Not because of negligence, but because the same catastrophe that was killing them had also silenced their voice. They died calling for help that never came, and the people they called never knew they were calling. Sandurai filed a report. She routed it through standard intelligence channels to the Ascendancy's historical communications archive, flagged it as a recovered legacy signal of historical significance, and attached her full analysis of the propagation path. She expected the archive to acknowledge it within a few days, file it, and issue a notice to the academic institutions that maintained the convergence case study. What she did not expect was the message that arrived on her console 41 hours later, encrypted on a diplomatic channel she had never personally received traffic on, bearing the authentication codes of the Ascendancy's Ministry of External Affairs. Liaison Officer, SWNNDURAI, your recovered signal has been flagged by External AFFAIRS. The propagation analysis indicates the original distress signal, transited through relay infrastructure, including NODES, designated under the Terran Cooperative's Deep Space Monitoring Network. The Terran Cooperative has been NOTIFIED through diplomatic channels. Terran External AFFAIRS has requested direct consultation with the originating analyst. You are instructed to stand by for diplomatic liaison assignment authorization. Ministry of External AFFAIRS, 7th Directorate. Sandurai read it twice. She understood each word individually. Together, they formed a sentence that made no sense. The Terrans wanted to talk to her about a 300-year-old distress signal from a dead colony. She had heard of the Terran Cooperative. Every signals officer in the Ascendancy had studied their communications protocols at a basic level. They were required to, because the Terrans maintained the most extensive deep space monitoring network in the known galaxy, and any signal that traveled far enough eventually passed through Terran-monitored space. The Terrans were not members of the Ascendancy. They were not allies exactly, though they were not adversaries either. They occupied a diplomatic position that the Ascendancy's analysts described as persistent lateral presence, always there, always listening, never quite aligned with anyone's agenda but never quite opposed to it either. The diplomatic consultation began 3 days later, conducted through encrypted relay from Pale Terminus to a Terran diplomatic vessel designated the TCS Albright, which had been redirected from routine patrol to a rendezvous point 17 light-years from Sandurai Station. The consultation was led, on the Terran side, by Senior Envoy Margox Odeline. Sandurai had expected a signals technician. Instead, she found herself facing a diplomat, a woman in her late middle years, gray-haired, calm-faced, wearing the dark formal uniform of the Terran Cooperative's External Affairs Division. She spoke Galactic Standard with the precise, unhurried cadence of someone who had spent decades choosing her words carefully. Liaison Officer Sandurai, Odeline said, her image sharp on the encrypted relay screen. Thank you for agreeing to this consultation. I've read your propagation analysis. It's thorough work. Thank you, Envoy. I should note that the signal is of purely historical interest. The colony at Verath Crossing was relieved by Ascendancy forces 312 years ago. The survivors were evacuated. I'm aware. Odeline folded her hands on the desk. The reason I've requested this consultation is not the colony, it's the signal's path. She transmitted a file. Sandurai opened it and found her own propagation analysis, annotated with additional data she had not had access to. The Terrans had mapped the signal's full 3-century journey with a precision that made her own work look like a rough sketch. Every relay bounce, every gravitational deflection, every atmospheric interference event was catalogued, time-stamped, and cross-referenced with the Terran network's historical logs. Your signal, Odeline said, transited through 11 relay nodes during its journey. 6 are Drevani infrastructure. 3 are neutral navigational beacons maintained by the Galactic Transit Authority. And 2 relay nodes TRN 7714 and TRN 7715 are part of the Terran Cooperative's Deep Space Monitoring Network. I noted those nodes in my analysis, Sandurai said. I assumed they were passive relays. That assumption is incorrect. Sandurai paused. Envoy. TRN 7714 and TRN 7715 are active monitoring stations, maintained under the terms of the Interspecies Signal Sovereignty Compact, specifically Article 41, which governs the handling of distress signals that transit through the monitoring networks of non-originating species. Sandurai knew the compact. She had studied it at the Academy. Article 41 required any species whose monitoring network detected a distress signal from another species to notify the originating authority and provide relay assistance if requested. It had been written 400 years ago and was widely considered a relic, a piece of infrastructure law that predated the current diplomatic architecture. Nobody invoked Article 41 anymore. There had never been a reason to. You're telling me, Sandurai said carefully, that your monitoring network detected the Verath Crossing distress signal 312 years ago. Not in real time. The signal was degraded and below automated alert thresholds when it transited our nodes. It was logged as background traffic, unresolved carrier wave, origin indeterminate, archived and never reviewed. Odeline paused. Until your propagation analysis was shared through diplomatic channels. When our administrators cross-referenced your work with our historical logs, they found the matching entries. The signal passed through our network 291 years ago. We logged it. We did not recognize it as a distress signal. We did not act. The silence on the channel stretched. Envoy, Sandurai said, the colony was relieved by other means. Your network's failure to flag the signal did not cause additional harm. That is the Ascendancy's position. It may be factually correct, but it is not the Terran Cooperative's position. Sandurai waited. Article 41 does not contain a statute of limitations, Odeline said. It says, upon detection. Our network detected that signal. We failed to recognize it. Under Article 41, we had an obligation to notify the Drevani Ascendancy. We did not. 300 years ago. The Terran Cooperative does not consider the passage of time to nullify a treaty obligation. We are filing a formal notification acknowledging our failure, and we are prepared to discuss remedial measures. Sandurai felt vertigo. Remedial measures for a 3-century-old disaster that was already resolved. The disaster was resolved. The treaty obligation was not. This was where the political dimension opened, and Sandurai understood with the clarity of someone who spent her career parsing signals for hidden structures, that the 300-year-old distress call had become a diplomatic instrument. The Ascendancy's Ministry of External Affairs convened an emergency session of the 7th Directorate within hours of Sandurai's report on the consultation. She was summoned to Vethar Prime to provide testimony. She made the transit in a fast courier. 16 hours of subspace travel during which she reviewed every document she could access regarding Article 41 and the Terran Cooperative's diplomatic history. What she found unsettled her. The Terran Cooperative had invoked Article 41 exactly 4 times in the Compact's 400-year history. The Selkari Dominion in 1689, a colony ship distress signal missed by Terran Relay Station TRN 4201. The Orvith Republic in 1771, a military convoy's emergency beacon transiting unrecognized through TRN 6119. The Tessarene Provincial Authority in 1844, a deep space prospector's mayday that TRN 5503 logged as interference. And the Vacuole Trade Consortium in 1902, a freighter fleet's automated distress pulse that passed through TRN 8847 without triggering the alert threshold. Each time the invocation was prompted by a genuine failure. Each time the Terrans formally acknowledged it and proposed modest remedial measures, upgraded algorithms, additional stations, joint protocol reviews. Each time the diplomatic relationship shifted not dramatically, not confrontationally, but structurally. Joint signal monitoring agreements, technology sharing arrangements. The Terrans made themselves useful, and the usefulness became permanent. The Selkari now shared a fully integrated monitoring grid with the Terrans. The Orvith's entire outer territory relay network ran on Terran-designed detection algorithms. The Tessarene had 3 standing signals liaison teams embedded in their fleet. The Vacuole's trade routes were monitored by a joint array that had caught 14 emergency situations in its first decade of operation. 4 species, 4 failures, 4 remedial frameworks, 4 permanent partnerships. It was the most elegant diplomatic strategy Sandurai had ever seen, and she had spent her career studying the Velori, who were not amateurs. The 7th Directorate's hearing chamber on Vethar Prime was a circular room with high windows that let in the pale blue light of the Vethar star. Sandurai sat at the witness console facing a semicircle of 7 officials, senior diplomats, intelligence analysts, and 1 representative from High Command Signals Division. Director Kaval Renthasi, the Directorate's chief, was a tall Drevani male with weathered gray-blue skin and the careful eyes of someone who had survived decades in government by never being surprised. He opened by reading the Terran notification into the record. Liaison Officer, walk us through the propagation path. Sandurai did. She presented the data cleanly: the 11 relay nodes, the transit through TRN 7714 and TRN 7715, the log entries, the Terran failure to flag. She used the Terran annotated propagation analysis to show the precise moment, 291 years ago, when the signal had passed through the Terran network, was logged, and was not recognized. When she finished, Renthasi leaned forward. Could the Terran network reasonably have been expected to identify this signal at the time of transit? The signal was heavily degraded. The distress encoding was partially intact, but the carrier was below standard thresholds. A dedicated analyst might have identified it. An automated system would not. So the failure was not negligence. Not by any reasonable standard. Yet they acknowledge it as a treaty violation. Yes, Director. Renthasi exchanged a glance with the intelligence representative overseer Thela Vasank, sharp-featured, quiet, whose presence at a diplomatic hearing told Sandurai everything about how seriously the Ascendancy was taking this. Liaison Officer, Vasank said. Her voice was cool and precise, the voice of someone who had spent a career extracting meaning from things people did not say. Set aside the signal data. What is the Terran Cooperative doing here? They're opening a door, Sandurai said. Article 41 gives them a procedurally clean reason to establish direct contact on a matter of mutual signal infrastructure. The failure is genuine. The acknowledgement is strategic. They're proposing joint monitoring arrangements that would integrate Terran and Drevani detection networks across the transit corridor. To what end? Presence. The Terrans don't conquer territory. They don't impose trade agreements or demand political concessions. They build infrastructure. Every Article 41 invocation has resulted in permanent Terran presence in the other species' communications architecture. Not by force, by invitation, after demonstrating that the invitation would be useful. Vosank's expression did not change. You've described strategic expansion through treaty compliance. I've described what the data shows, Overseer. The hearing recessed. Sandurai stood at one of the high windows during the break, looking out over the administrative quarter of the capital, the pale stone buildings, the terraced gardens that climbed the hill toward the Signals Academy where she had studied the convergence as a textbook case, where Kosen's portrait hung in the Hall of Exemplars. She thought about Kosen at Vareth crossing a woman 4 years younger than Sandurai was now, who had spent 11 hours broadcasting a signal that nobody heard, who had died at her console with her hand on the transmitter, who had done everything right. Sandurai had written a 12-page analysis of the convergence at the Academy. She had received high marks. She had never once asked the obvious question, where did the signal go? It had gone everywhere except where it was aimed. It had bounced through 11 relay nodes across 3 centuries. 2 of those nodes belonged to a species that was now standing in the Ascendancy's doorway, acknowledging a treaty obligation that nobody else would have bothered to invoke, holding a receipt for a failure that had cost nothing additional, and offering to make sure the next signal reached someone. When the hearing resumed, Renthasi informed Sandurai she had been reassigned Article 41 Response Coordinator, reporting directly to the 7th Directorate. She would manage the diplomatic consultation with the Terran Cooperative, provide technical analysis as required, and report to the Directorate daily. The reassignment carried a rank elevation. She was now Senior Liaison Officer, 2 grades above her previous position. Sandurai registered this with the detached awareness of someone who understood that the promotion was not a reward. It was a leash. The Directorate wanted her close because she was the only person in the Ascendancy who had studied both the Signal's technical path and the Terran's diplomatic pattern, and they needed to know what she thought before she told anyone else. The consultation with Odeline proceeded over the following weeks through encrypted relay sessions that grew longer and more substantive as the diplomatic framework took shape. Sandurai found the Terran diplomat to be exactly what she appeared, a woman who had learned that precision was a form of respect, and who extended that respect to everyone she spoke with, including a recently promoted signals officer who was clearly out of her depth in diplomatic waters. In their 4th session, Sandurai asked a question that had been forming since the first conversation. Envoy, why me? Your notification was filed through the Ministry of External Affairs. You could be speaking to a senior diplomat. Instead, you requested the originating analyst, a Third Watch communications liaison on a mid-tier station. Odeline considered the question with the unhurried deliberation Sandurai had come to recognize as genuine thought rather than performance. Because you're the one who looked, the signal was flagged for deletion. You chose to examine it. That tells me something about you that your rank does not. It tells you I was bored on the Third Watch. It tells me you pay attention to things other people delete. That is the single most useful quality a signals officer can have, and it is the quality that this consultation requires. When Sandurai asked directly whether Article 41 was a mechanism for permanent presence, Odeline answered without hesitation. Yes. The diplomatic caveat did not come. Sandurai waited for it, the qualifier, the hedge, the reframing that would soften the admission into something more palatable. It did not arrive. You're not going to frame that differently. Why would I? You've identified the pattern. If I denied it, you'd trust me less, and the consultation would lose its foundation. The Terran Cooperative wants a permanent signals liaison with the Drevani Ascendancy. Article 41 gives us a clean basis. The historical failure is genuine. The strategic interest is genuine. Both are true simultaneously. And if the Ascendancy declines, we file the notification, acknowledge the failure, and depart. The compact doesn't compel the receiving party to accept remedial measures. That's a clean exit. We've used it twice. Both times the other party initially declined, then contacted us within 5 years. Because the need became apparent. Because infrastructure gaps don't resolve themselves. The signal from Verath Crossing traveled for 312 years because the relay network between Drevani space and the outer territories is old, degraded, and undermaintained. That's not a Terran problem. That's a Drevani problem. We're offering to help solve it. But the signal data suggests you haven't in 3 centuries. The words landed. They were not hostile or smug. They were factual, delivered with the quiet competence of someone who knew exactly how this conversation would unfold, not because she was manipulating it, but because the underlying reality was always the same. Signals that should reach someone don't, because the infrastructure to carry them is old or neglected or simply insufficient. The physics does not care about politics. Meanwhile, the political dimension deepened inside the Ascendancy itself. Sondurai's daily briefings to the 7th Directorate became the hinge point for a debate that exposed fault lines she had not known existed. The military faction, Fleet Admiral Dorson Kelvaro, 40 years in high command, a career built on the principle that the Ascendancy security architecture should depend on nobody, but the Ascendancy argued for rejection. His position was blunt, delivered in the voice of a man who had spent 4 decades protecting borders. The Terrans were inserting intelligence assets into the Ascendancy's signals infrastructure. Accepting would be the first step toward dependency. If our relay network is degraded, Kelvaro said during one classified session, his voice filling the chamber with the authority of a man who had commanded fleets, we upgraded ourselves. We do not invite a foreign power to embed its personnel inside our detection grid. The diplomatic faction, Undersecretary Félix Orn-Saval, 2 decades managing the Ascendancy's Galactic Transit Authority relationship, a pragmatist whose career was built on the principle that no nation could afford every piece of infrastructure it needed, argued for acceptance. The Terrans were offering to fund and build infrastructure that the Ascendancy could not afford. The question, Orn-Saval said, is not whether the Terrans have strategic interests. Every species at the compact table has strategic interests. The question is whether their interests align with ours. They want to listen. We have things that need to be heard. The alignment is structural. Between these poles, a third faction emerged, one that Sondurai had not anticipated. Archivist General Melis Ko-Daran, head of the Historical Communications Archive, arrived at the hearing uninvited, carrying a data case that she set on the table with the deliberate care of someone placing evidence before a tribunal. Before you decide about the Terrans, Ko-Daran said, I suggest you decide about the signals. She opened the case, 17 files. Each was a distress or emergency communication from an outer territory settlement, ship, or installation that had arrived at high command with a delay exceeding 48 hours. 3 exceeded 1 week. 1, the mining outpost at Seleth 9, exceeded 3 months. In that case, the delay contributed to the loss of 214 lives. The files had been in the archive for decades, some for over a century. Nobody had compiled them. Nobody had looked at them as a set. Ko-Daran had. These are the signals we know about, Ko-Daran said. The ones that eventually arrived. What I cannot tell you is how many signals never arrived at all. The signals that bounced and degraded and were flagged as background radiation, and deleted the way Liaison Officer Sondurai's signal almost was. How many others are still traveling? How many reached no one? The chamber was silent. Calvaro spoke first. The data is compelling but does not change the strategic calculus. We can upgrade our own relay infrastructure without foreign assistance. With what appropriation, Admiral? Sandurai said. The words came out before she could weigh them, propelled by weeks of reading budget documents and signal logs and the quiet accumulated weight of numbers that nobody had wanted to add together. The 7th Directorate's last budget request for relay infrastructure was denied by the Treasury Council 6 months ago. The one before that was denied 2 years prior. The relay network has been flagged for upgrade in every 5-year review since I've been alive. The funding has been deferred every time. Calvaro's jaw tightened. That is a budgetary matter, not a strategic one. Respectfully, Admiral, the 18,000 dead at Verath Crossing did not distinguish between budgetary matters and strategic ones. They followed the protocols. They used the correct frequency. They aimed the signal at the correct authority. And nobody heard them. The reason nobody heard them is because the relay network, the same network we're debating right now, was already degraded enough in 1714 that a coronal event could scatter a correctly aimed distress signal into oblivion. That was 3 centuries ago. The network is older now. The funding is still deferred. She paused. She could feel the weight of the chamber on her, the attention of 7 officials who were accustomed to hearing carefully measured testimony, not the unplanned argument of a signals officer who had been studying budget tables at 2 in the morning. The Terrans are standing in our doorway with a 3-century-old receipt, acknowledging that they should have heard that signal too, and they're offering to help make sure we hear the next one. At the cost of permanent Terran presence. At that cost, and I am not dismissing it, Admiral, but I am asking what cost we've already been paying. 17 delayed signals. 214 lives at Seleth 9. And an unknown number of signals that never arrived, signals we can't count because we never heard them. The chamber was quiet after Sandurai spoke. She had not planned to say any of it. She had been trained to present data, not to advocate. But the data had an argument embedded in it, and she had let the argument speak. Calvaro stared at her across the hearing table. His expression was not hostile. It was the expression of a military officer who recognized an adversary who believed what she was saying, and who knew that sincere adversaries were harder to dismiss than calculating ones. "You understand," he said quietly, "that once we open this door we cannot close it." "I understand that the door has been open for 3 centuries, Admiral. We just didn't notice, because nobody was listening at it." The deadlock lasted 11 days. Sandurai testified at 6 sessions, answered over 300 questions, produced 4 supplementary analyses. She slept an average of 4 hours a night. She ate meals at the witness console and dreamed, when she slept at all, about waveforms, the modulated cadence of a distress signal traveling through 3 centuries of empty space, losing strength with every bounce, fading into the noise floor, still carrying the voices of people who had died with the transmitter running. On the 5th day, Vasank requested a private briefing. The overseer took Sandurai to a secure room adjacent to the hearing chamber, a small, windowless space with encrypted walls that hummed faintly with countermeasure fields, and asked her a question that nobody else on the Directorate had thought to ask. The Terran Cooperative has 4 existing Article 41 partnerships. Have any of them been used for intelligence collection? Sandurai had anticipated this question and had prepared the analysis, 2 days of research into every available audit record from the 4 existing partnerships. I examined the available records from all 4 partnerships. The Selkari, the Orvith, the Tessarine, and the Vakul have all conducted independent audits of their joint networks within the first 5 years of operation. None of the audits found evidence of intelligence collection through the monitoring infrastructure. The Terran personnel in each partnership have access to signal traffic, but the joint protocols restrict their access to distress band frequencies. Diplomatic, military, and commercial traffic is excluded. Protocols can be circumvented. They can, but the Terrans have had embedded personnel in the Selkari monitoring grid for 337 years, Overseer. If they were using it for intelligence collection, someone would have detected it by now. The Selkari are not naive. Vasank considered this, or the Terrans are very good. That is also possible. But if the Terrans are good enough to maintain covert intelligence collection through 4 separate joint networks for over 3 centuries without detection by 4 separate species, then they are good enough to collect intelligence from our signals infrastructure without our knowledge or cooperation. And the question of whether we accept the Article 41 framework is irrelevant. They'd already be listening. Vasank's expression did not change, but something shifted behind her eyes, the faint acknowledgement of an argument she could not refute without introducing an assumption she could not support. On the 9th day, Renthasi asked the question she had been expecting since the beginning. Liaison officer, in your professional judgment, should we accept? She looked at the director, at Kelvar, whose suspicion was genuine and born of real experience, at Orn Saval, whose pragmatism was equally genuine and born of equally real constraints, at Kodarin, whose data case still sat open on the table, 17 files spread like evidence at a trial, at Vasank, whose expression revealed nothing but whose question in the secure room had revealed everything about the intelligence community's actual concern. Director, she said, the colonists at Verath Crossing sent a distress signal on the correct frequency to the correct authority using the correct protocols. The signal never arrived. Not because of negligence, not because of incompetence, but because the same catastrophe that was killing them also silenced them. They did everything right, and they died calling for help that never came. She paused. The Terrans are standing here 3 centuries later saying, we should have heard you. We didn't. We'd like to make sure it never happens again. They're also establishing a strategic foothold. Both things are true. The question is whether the infrastructure improvement is worth the cost, and the answer depends on how many Verath crossings we're willing to risk. Renthasi studied her for a long moment. Then he looked at each official in turn, taking the measure of the room the way a man takes the measure of a decision he will have to defend. Then back at Sondurai. How many have we already risked? 17 that we know of. The signals that arrived late we can count. The signals that never arrived at all. She left the sentence unfinished. In the silence, she could hear the ventilation system cycling air through the chamber, and she thought about Ko-Sen at Verath Crossing, sealing the communications center, broadcasting into nothing, wondering if anyone would ever hear. The vote was 5-2, the ascendancy accepted. Kelvaro's dissent was noted. His vote was cast with the quiet dignity of a man who believed he was right and who understood that being outvoted did not make him wrong. Sondurai respected it. The strategic cost was real. The Terrans would have permanent presence in the Ascendancy's signals architecture. That presence would grow. It was designed to grow. The agreement was signed 6 weeks later in the same hearing chamber, sunlight falling across the table through the high windows. Sondurai attended as liaison coordinator, alongside Renthasi, Orn Saval, Kodarin. On the Terran side, Odaline, a quiet senior technician named Chief Warrant Officer Dara Nkemelu, who would become the senior Terran signals officer at Pale Terminus, and a legal attaché who sat in the corner and said nothing. The agreement established a joint signal monitoring protocol with upgraded detection algorithms deployed across the transit corridor between Drevani space and the outer territories. 2 new monitoring stations at Terran expense. A standing liaison team, 3 Terran technicians and 2 Drevani analysts embedded at Pale Terminus, upgraded from mid-tier signals post to joint monitoring facility. Sandurai returned to Pale Terminus with a mandate and a team. Her first act as liaison coordinator was recommissioning Tertiary Legacy Channel 9, the ancient receiver that caught the whisper, still wired to the atmospheric recycler conduit that nobody had bothered to pull into the joint network's active array. When the Terran technicians asked why she prioritized antique hardware, she said, "Because it heard something that everything else missed. I don't retire things that listen." Nkemelu considered this with the slow nod of someone filing a fact away. "We have a saying, the ear that heard the whisper stays on watch." "You have a saying for everything," Sandurai observed. "We have infrastructure for everything. The sayings come free." The integration took 14 months. Sandurai worked alongside Nkemelu and her team as the Terran technicians installed upgraded detection modules, ran cable through the station's aging conduit network, and calibrated systems that had never been designed to work together. The Drevani array architecture used crystalline resonance matrices for signal processing. The Terran modules used quantum state interferometry. Making them communicate required a translation layer that Nkemelu's senior technician, a taciturn man named Warrant Officer Haas, built from scratch over the course of 6 weeks, sleeping in the array bay and sustaining himself on ration bars and a thermos of something dark that he referred to as coffee, and that the Drevani station crew regarded with the same wary respect they would extend to a mild toxin. "It's a beverage," Haas said when asked, "from a plant on Earth." "It smells like a chemical weapon," said the station's environmental officer. "Different function. Same intensity." Nkemelu's team worked 16-hour days without complaint, ate whatever the galley produced without comment, and solved compatibility problems with the quiet efficiency of people who had done exactly this before, on exactly this kind of station, for exactly this kind of partnership. Sandurai found herself watching the way they worked not with the suspicion that Kelvaro had urged, but with the professional attention of a signals officer studying an unfamiliar protocol. The Terrans did not grandstand. They did not claim credit. They did not assert superiority over the Drevani systems they were integrating with. When a Drevani array component outperformed the Terran equivalent, which happened twice, in the high-frequency discrimination range and in the subspace carrier isolation band, Nkemelu noted it in her integration report and recommended adopting the Drevani specification for those parameters. "You're keeping our components," Sandurai said, reading the report. "Your high-frequency discriminator is 11% more precise than ours," Nkemelu said. "Why would we replace it?" "Because most species in your position would want the entire system to be their own design. It's cleaner, it's simpler to maintain, and it makes the other party dependent on your specifications. Most species in our position haven't done this 4 times before. We've learned that the best listening system is the one that uses the best components, regardless of who built them. Pride is expensive. Missed signals are more expensive." In its first operational month, the joint network detected 3 distress signals that the legacy system would have delayed by at least 4 hours each. 2 were standard emergency beacons from merchant vessels with engine failures routine, but the 4-hour difference was the difference between an orderly rescue and a drifting vessel running out of air. The 3rd was a medical emergency from a research station in the outer territories whose primary transmitter had failed. The backup signal was degraded enough that the old system would have flagged it as noise. In its first year, the count rose to 31. Most arrived within minutes, a few within hours. One was 11 days, a mining vessel stranded in the outer territories, its transmitter damaged in a debris strike, broadcasting on a frequency too degraded for standard detection. The mining vessel's captain, a woman named Foreman Captain Kesseth Aldrun, had been broadcasting for 9 days before the joint network detected her signal. She had exhausted her primary transmitter on the 2nd day, and had rigged a secondary from salvaged components that produced a signal barely distinguishable from cosmic background noise. The joint algorithms caught it. The Ascendancy dispatched a rescue ship. 27 miners went home. When the rescue ship arrived, Aldrin's first transmission was, "To whoever heard us, our signal was aimed at the sector relay. It never arrived, did it?" It had not. The sector relay was one of the 4 degraded nodes in the transit corridor. Aldrin's signal had bounced off it and scattered into the monitoring corridor, where the joint network's upgraded algorithms, the same algorithms that had been designed to catch exactly this kind of degraded, bounced, misrouted signal, had flagged it. Sandurai read the after-action report and felt something she could now name. Not grief, not the cold weight of the Verath crossing signal, not the vertigo of the diplomatic hearing or the exhaustion of the 11-day deadlock. Purpose, the grounded, specific purpose of someone who had found a 300-year-old scream and turned it into a system that would catch the next whisper before it faded. In the second year, the network caught something that changed the political calculus entirely. A Drevani patrol corvette operating near the outer rim had suffered what appeared to be a standard engine failure and transmitted a routine distress call. The call reached high command without delay. The standard system worked for this one, the signal strong and properly aimed. But the joint network also caught the transmission through a secondary detection path, and the Terran algorithms flagged an anomaly that the Drevani systems had not. A secondary signal buried deep in the transmission's subcarrier layer, indicating the failure was not mechanical. The reactor had been deliberately overloaded. Someone aboard had disabled the safety interlocks. Enkemelu's team isolated the subcarrier data and relayed it immediately to the Ascendancy's intelligence division. The saboteur was identified, a junior engineer with ties to a separatist faction in the outer territories, and apprehended before the reactor reached critical failure. 43 crew survived an incident that, without the joint network's deeper analysis, would have been logged as a tragic engineering failure and never investigated. Overseer Vasank transmitted a single line to Sandurai on an encrypted channel. The network paid for itself today. Calvaro read the intelligence report. He did not retract his dissent. The strategic concern remained valid, and he was not a man who changed his position because the evidence had temporarily aligned against it. But when the joint network's annual operating budget came before the Security Council for review, he voted to approve it without objection and without comment. In the fourth year, the network caught something Sandurai had not expected, a signal from a Valori trading vessel not Drevani, not Terran, not covered by the agreement that had drifted into the monitoring corridor after a navigational system failure. The signal was a routine position update, not a distress call. But the vessel's reported position was wrong hundreds of light years from its filed course, and the joint network's pattern-matching algorithms flagged the discrepancy. Sandurai and Enkemelu reviewed the data together in the monitoring bay, the Valori signal's trajectory displayed on the tactical holo between them. "We're outside Article 41, Sandurai said. "The Valori aren't party to our agreement." "Technically, yes," Enkemelu said. "But Article 41 doesn't specify species in its core obligation. It governs distress signals that transit through monitoring networks. If that vessel is in trouble and our network detected it, then we have a capability. The obligation is up to you." Sandurai relayed the discrepancy to the Valori Compact's Trade Monitoring Authority through diplomatic channels. The Valori investigated and found the vessel drifting toward an uncharted debris field. Its navigational computer failed, its crew unaware of their actual trajectory. The recovery team retrieved the crew of 11 without injury. 3 days later, the Valori calculated that without intervention, the vessel would have entered the debris field in approximately 9 hours. The crew would not have survived. The Valori Compact sent a formal acknowledgement measured, polite, carefully noncommittal in the way that Valori diplomatic correspondence always was, revealing nothing about intent while expressing precisely calibrated gratitude. But attached to the acknowledgement, beneath the diplomatic formalities, was a request. The Valori wished to discuss the possibility of integrating their own trade route monitoring infrastructure with the Drevani Terran detection array. Sandurai read the request and understood with perfect clarity that the door the Terrans had opened was getting wider, not because the Terrans were pushing, because the galaxy kept producing signals that needed to be heard, and the network that heard them kept proving its value, and the species that could hear each other better than they could hear alone kept choosing to listen together. In the 6th year, the Valori formally joined the monitoring compact. The negotiations took 14 months. The Valori negotiated the way tides moved, as always, but the outcome was never in doubt once the 11 crew members from the trading vessel returned home and told their families what had happened. In the 7th year, the Orvith Republic, already running Terran detection algorithms from their own Article 41 partnership, established after the TRN 6119 incident, proposed a cross-linked grid that would connect the Drevani Terran corridor with the Orvith Terran corridor, creating a continuous monitoring net across 500 light-years of previously uncoordinated space. Sandurai had predicted infrastructure. She had predicted permanent presence. She had predicted strategic positioning. She had laid all of this out for the 7th Directorate 10 years ago, clearly and without euphemism. What she had not predicted was this: that the Terrans would build a network so useful that other species would voluntarily extend it, and that the Ascendancy, the species that had debated for 11 days and accepted by a margin of 5-2, would become the anchor point of a multi-species monitoring grid that now covered more listening territory than any single nation's network had ever achieved. She brought this observation to Odaline during one of their regular liaison sessions, conducted now not through encrypted relay but in person, aboard the joint facility that Pale Terminus had become larger, busier, staffed by 3 species, its corridors carrying conversations in 4 languages. "You planned for this," Sandurai said. "It was not a question." "We planned for the possibility," Odaline said. "We build the first door. What walks through it is up to the galaxy." That's either the most honest answer I've ever heard or the most carefully constructed one. In my experience, the most carefully constructed answers are the honest ones. The dishonest answers are easy. The honest ones take work. The 10th anniversary commemoration was held on Vethar Prime, in the same hearing chamber where the vote had been 5-2 and the sunlight had fallen across the table. The high windows still let in the pale blue light. Odaline was there, older now, her gray hair white, her calm unchanged, still wearing the dark formal uniform she had worn at the first consultation. Renthasi, retired but present, his weathered face carrying the satisfaction of a man who had cast the deciding vote correctly. Enkemelu, 10 years at Pale Terminus, promoted twice, still wearing the same quiet competence she had brought on her first day. Minister Orn Saville, who had risen from undersecretary to lead the external affairs portfolio. Kodarin, the archivist general, whose data case of 17 delayed signals was now a historical exhibit in the archive's public gallery, visited by academy cadets who studied it as part of the infrastructure failure curriculum. And Kelvaro, Fleet Admiral Dorson Kelvaro, retired now, attending for the first time, standing at the back of the chamber in full dress uniform, saying nothing. The formal remarks were brief. The numbers spoke for themselves, the network's detection statistics projected on the chamber wall, signals intercepted, response times reduced, lives saved, a running total that updated quarterly, currently at 412. After the formal remarks, Sandurai found herself with Odaline at one of the high windows, looking out over the capital as the pale blue light softened toward evening. "Envoy," she said, "I have a question I've never asked." I suspect I know it. When you first received my propagation analysis, when you saw that a 300-year-old distress signal from a dead colony had passed through your network unrecognized, what was your first thought? Odeline was quiet for a long moment. The pale blue light fell across her face, and Sandurai saw something she had not seen in 10 years of meetings and negotiations, and the careful work of building a system from the ground up, not calculation, not strategy, something rawer. My first thought, Odeline said, was that 41,000 people sent a distress signal and nobody heard it. My second thought was that our network logged it and we didn't even look. My third was that it was 300 years ago and every one of them was beyond any help we could offer. She paused. My fourth thought was that we could make sure it didn't happen to the next 41,000. That's the thought I brought to the consultation. And the strategic positioning. Real, but the infrastructure exists because we build it. We build it because the alternative is a galaxy full of signals nobody hears. Your colony screamed for 312 years. Our network caught the whisper and filed it as background noise. That is not acceptable. The strategy and the conviction are the same thing. They always have been. Sandurai considered this. She had spent the first 2 years of the partnership waiting for the strategic dimension to override the genuine one, waiting for the listening posts to become intelligence assets, for the Terran technicians to start asking questions about Drevani military communications, for the cooperative framework to reveal itself as a Trojan structure. I spent the first 2 years waiting for the strategic dimension to override the genuine one, she said. And 10 years, 412 lives. The only thing your personnel have done with the data from our joint network is route distress signals faster. That's all we built it to do. At the far side of the chamber, Kelvaro watched the Terran and Drevani technicians exchange data on the operations display. His dissent was still in the record. He had never retracted it. But when Nkemelu crossed the room and offered him a data tablet showing the network's detection rates, the signal types intercepted, the response times, the lives saved figure, he took it. He read it. He scrolled through the data with the thoroughness of a man who had spent 40 years in high command reading intelligence assessments. When he finished, he looked at Nkemelu for a long moment. Your subharmonic interference algorithm, he said. I read the technical brief last year. It's better than ours. Yes, sir, Nkemelu said. Based on a listening methodology we developed after a similar failure in our own network. About 200 years ago, we lost a signal. We built a better ear. Kelvaro nodded once. He set the tablet down and returned to his position at the back of the room. He did not retract his dissent. He did not need to. Sandurai turned to the window. The light was fading, the pale blue deepening toward evening, the administrative quarter below settling into its nighttime configuration, lights coming on in the government buildings, the terraced gardens darkening, the academy's tower catching the last of the light. When I found that signal, she said quietly, not quite to Odeline, not quite to herself, I almost let the system delete it, flagged as background radiation. I was tired, third watch, I almost didn't look. But you looked. I looked, and I found 41,000 voices screaming into the void for 312 years, and the only reason I heard them was because a power conduit nobody bothered to pull kept an obsolete receiver running on a channel nobody monitored. And now, Sandurai thought about the dead. 18,000 suffocated in corridors and modules at Verath Crossing. 22,000 who survived because a supply vessel arrived by chance. She thought about the signal, carrying their voices for 3 centuries through 11 relay nodes, losing coherence with every bounce, fading into the noise floor, until it arrived at her console as a whisper that should have been deleted. She thought about the network, the algorithms, the stations, the 27 miners Aldrun had kept alive with a salvaged transmitter, and 9 days of broadcasting into nothing. The 43 crew of a sabotaged corvette, the 11 Valori traders drifting toward a debris field, the 412 lives on the commemoration display. The dead of Verath Crossing could not be saved. They had been dust for 3 centuries. Their signal had traveled longer than most civilizations survived, and it had arrived too late for anything except memory. But their signal had built something. Not a memorial, the Ascendancy had memorials. Not a case study, the Academy had case studies. A system. A listening network that stretched across species and treaties and centuries of accumulated mistrust, built by people who disagreed about strategy and agreed about signals, who understood that the cost of not listening was measured in silences that nobody could count. They screamed and nobody heard them, but the echo of that scream built the ears that would hear the next one. Now, Sondurai said, "We listen." Odaline nodded. She did not smile. She stood beside Sondurai at the window and both were quiet. 2 women from 2 species separated by biology and history, and 3 centuries of a signal that should have been heard and wasn't, looking out at a city under a pale blue star, while above them the network listened. Somewhere in the deep, a signal was traveling. It might be a navigational ping. It might be a trade intercept. It might be a whisper from a colony that was dying and didn't know if anyone would hear. The network was listening. That was the point. Sondurai turned from the window. She had work to do, signals to sort, protocols to review, a joint monitoring report due by end of shift. The voices of Verath Crossing were 3 centuries gone. But the system they had built, the network that listened, the treaty that held, the partnership that endured was alive and operational and hearing things the old world would have missed. That was the entry in the record. That was enough.